time getting those too. And I'm like,
Oh,
I
good.
already do so many things, I just don't have time.
Yeah.
Ugh, but. All
It's
right, so in the interest of everyone's time, I want to get started because it is 3:35 according to my cell phone, even though every other clock in my office right now says something different. Sarah can let people in as we're talking, but I want to introduce myself for those of you on the call who don't know who I am. My name is Virginia DeLong, and I am the chairman of the Government Relations and Advocacy Committee for CSCA, also known as GRAC. And I am also the Connecticut School Counselor of the Year. I am starting to become more comfortable saying that, but it's still very awkward for me. So, and my fellow counselors on this call would yell at me if I didn't. So I am delighted to offer this workshop today with our lobbyist, Brian, who I'll let him introduce himself and just kind of talk a little bit about what he does for CSCA in a minute. But we wanted to offer this because this is prime season to be contacting legislators. I'm also hoping to offer kind of a follow-up workshop in November after the election, so we can kind of talk about talking points with the newly elected legislators once that's all said and done. So Brian, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name, for those who don't know me, Brian Sullivan. I work with Prisby and Associates, and CSCA is obviously one of our clients. So I strictly focus on lobbying really in Connecticut more than anything, although I do obviously pay attention to what's going on in Washington. My role is generally just to follow legislation, follow news, provide updates, work on strategy, work on grassroots lobbying in any way possible, and be your advocate at the Capitol. Obviously, that role has morphed and it's going to continue to morph. Actually, I was on a call with the Lobbying Association yesterday, and we are talking about what are the rules going to look like in the 2021 legislative session. It's looking like it's going to be a strictly virtual session. Where there's limited or no opportunity to be at the Capitol. And that really changes the dynamics that are in play. And I think we'll get into really the opportunities that it also presents people in the broader community to participate, whether it's in virtual hearings or in just reaching out to your elected officials via email or other social media communication. There's more ways to get in touch with your elected officials than ever before, and they've pretty much all transitioned to doing a lot of the work online. So I'm looking forward to digging into that.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to share my screen as I've put together a PowerPoint for us to view today. And Brian and I are going to go through that. And have at the end, if we have some time, which hopefully we will, this should not be more than an hour, then you can ask any questions that you might have of us. Our goal today is to make you more comfortable with this process and reaching out to your legislators, because this work cannot just be done by a few people. It has to be done by all of us advocating for the profession. So we want to make sure that you're as comfortable as you can be to start reaching out and doing that. So just give me 1 second here while I share my screen.
Yeah, while you pull that up, I'll just say that this is perhaps going to, we're about to embark into a legislative session that is not like anything else, because we just had a year where they passed practically no legislation. So there's a ton of issues that have been bottled up, not to mention just the changing nature of society that the legislature has to catch up, because we've been ruled, frankly, by executive orders and the governor. So now the legislature needs to catch up with the laws. So that presents a lot of opportunity, a lot of challenges, but it's really going to be quite a session next year.
Oh, I got very excited here. Okay, can everybody see my screen? If somebody can just let me know if you can see it.
We can see it.
Okay, perfect. All right, so again, Virginia DeLong and Brian Sullivan for the Government Relations and Advocacy Committee. So I just want to give you a little background on what CSCA has done since we have hired Brian and his counterpart, Ken Prisby, to do some lobbyist work for us. they've really been amazing and very helpful. We tried to do some grassroots stuff on our own, and it really is challenging and very difficult. And Brian and Ken have really helped us to get our foot in the door with a lot of different legislators and committees and groups that we need to make some headway on our advocacy efforts. So our first legislation that we passed was in 2017-2018 school year, and that was Public Act 1815, which was originally Senate Bill 186. And basically we started kind of small so that we could really get our name out there and get people to know who we were and what we do. And so we asked for all the state statute language that said guidance counselor or guidance counseling to be changed to school counselor or school counseling. Well, because there are still some people that hold a guidance counselor certification, they weren't willing to just completely change everything, but did agree to add next to anywhere where it said guidance counselor or guidance counseling, school counselor, school counseling. So it wasn't exactly what we wanted, but it was definitely a step in the right direction. So now all state statutes do say that. And I have noticed new things that have come out have said that. So it's good that they're definitely following the act that was passed. Then in 2018-2019, we tried to step it up a little bit more, and we wanted to, really push for a little bit more than we had the year before. So we were in the process of writing the comprehensive school counseling program framework at the state level, and we wanted to make sure that school districts were using that. So we were able to pass Public Act 1963, which were guidelines for a comprehensive school counseling program. And that allowed, while we were not, Cisco was not named by name, it was named as the State School Counseling Association, which we are the only one. So we were meant to work with the State Department of Education to roll out this comprehensive framework and push for schools to use it as part of the legislation. So that framework was just approved like last week. So Kim Traverso, who was our state Department of Education liaison for school counselors, is working with CSCA and the State Department of Education on how we're going to be rolling those out. A letter to superintendents is going to be going out this week or early next week. And then from there, we will have a plan to roll it out to individual school counseling departments. So please be patient and stay tuned, but we're very excited for that. Last year, in 2019-2020, the session, as you're probably aware, got cut short because of COVID. We had just testified like a week before everything got shut down on Senate Bill 312, and we were pushing for the 80-20 use of time for school counselors, meaning 80% of your time is used for direct services of a school counselor. And it also discussed eliminating testing duties for school counselors. So, test coordination, all that stuff that a lot of school counselors are still doing. We originally had gone in with what our number one ask always is, which is to create more school counseling positions at all levels, which we'll get into more later, and have better ratios. But as we were often been told, that has a fiscal note to it, and it wasn't in their budget. So maybe next year, which would be this year. And so that left us feeling good because at least they were considering it and thinking about it and really starting to understand the impact that school counselors have in our schools. I felt really good about the 80-20. I did probably one of the best testimonies I've ever done. They gave me over 20 minutes, which is unheard of in a committee meeting, to answer questions and to really talk about it. And I left there feeling amazing, and then COVID happened. So the bill didn't go anywhere, as did pretty much all the bills in the legislature because of COVID. So we're not giving up on that piece. However, now we're in a new year, 2020, 2021. And as Brian already has mentioned, we're not sure exactly how that's going to look, but it's definitely going to be different. But we're definitely pushing for an increase of school counselors in all schools. including elementary, with appropriate and reasonable ratios. And we really feel like this is now the perfect time for us to push for that because of COVID and all the stress that has been placed on social emotional learning during all of this. So we'll get more into that a little bit later, but I just wanted, for those of you who haven't been following, to have a little bit of the history of where we've moved with school counseling legislation. And Brian, in a few minutes, is going to talk about the process of how this all happens. And he had a great graphic that he shared with me, but I couldn't fit it into the PowerPoint. But I am going to figure out with our event planner how I can email that graphic of how a bill in Connecticut becomes a law, because it's a really great visual to have for yourself. So I'd like to email that out after today's presentation. And I'm also going to add it to our CISCA website under our advocacy work, so you can access it there as well.
Yeah, let me just add to the background. We were, throughout those several years that we've been advocating CISCA, that ultimate goal is consistently discussed and mentioned. So we were understanding that it wasn't going to happen in one legislative session, that this is a multiple year process, and even maybe next year is not necessarily a one and done. This is the Connecticut General Assembly usually takes a few years to get things done after they hear an issue. I think we have a number of key supporters. Obviously, the challenge is going to be just the budget numbers and the priorities overall, just the vast amount of work that they have to do. So those two challenges.
Agreed, absolutely. And I think that's where Ken and Brian have really been helpful, because they help us to understand what's realistic for us and how we should approach things, so that we can eventually get the things that we want. And obviously anything that costs money is going to take much longer, because, as they tell you all the time, we don't have any money. So they have to figure out where they're going to get it from. And we've provided some ideas on that as well. So it's not that we're just saying we want this and figure it out. We actually have provided some ideas on how that can happen. So Brian's going to talk a little bit about the legislative process, so you can have a better understanding, because I have to be honest, I have always enjoyed government and politics and all of that, but I myself have learned so much just by working with Ken and Brian and how this whole process works. So I'm going to leave it to Brian to explain that to you.
Yeah, so as most people probably know, Connecticut has a part-time General Assembly. So obviously the elections, every member of the House and Senate in Connecticut is up for re-election on November 3rd. Those elections will happen. The people that win the elections will then caucus, they'll name their leadership, the new Speaker of the House, the Senate President. They will choose chairman of committees, they'll choose deputy speakers, deputy leaders. That process all plays out in November, December. And at the same time, it's really a quick sprint. That's in normal years. It's a quick sprint to introducing bills, because come the first Wednesday after the first Monday in January, so I think it's like January 6th, the legislature goes into session. And a lot of times, right when they go into session, the committee already has some idea of the list of priorities. Now, in the long session, you have a bit more time early in the year. Usually there's kind of a January, February process of getting acquainted with the new legislature. There's organizational meetings. But this year, I don't know how much different it will be. Obviously, it'll be different in that I just might not be able to meet some of the new legislators, whereas I would have been introducing myself. And so that makes it even more challenging for lobbyists, but it also makes grassroots lobbying all the more important. So that's why really in November, December, you want to have your wish list down on what you're looking for. As you head into the process, you want to be developing a plan of action for the first few months of the legislative session. You want to be setting up the meetings come December. Now, some legislators don't want to meet right away. It's the holidays. But you have to work on and figuring out your avenues to getting your legislation drafted by the Education Committee. Now, I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but in the long session, which we're headed into in 2021, any legislator can propose any bill about any topic. So that gives us an avenue to use the grassroots lobbying to get your legislators in your districts to draft whatever CISCA's priorities might be, what Virginia outlined. They can put in those individual bills. The Education Committee then needs to raise the bill either for a public hearing or raise it as a committee bill. That bill is then raised by the committee and then put on a public hearing agenda, likely to be an all virtual hearing. People can then submit testimony. I obviously help with that process, but you can submit testimony, you can testify in public. Once the bill has that committee public hearing, it then needs to be voted on by that committee. And then it heads to either the House floor or the Senate floor, where if it doesn't need to go to another committee, so if it has a budget note, it needs to go to the Appropriations Committee. If it's related to higher education, even though it might be an education bill to start with, it needs to go to higher ed down the line. So if it doesn't need to go to one of those committees, it then can be taken up on the floor of the House or the Senate, where it needs to be passed in concurrence and then goes to the governor's desk for final signature. That is the 500-foot picture. There's a lot more details and information that goes into it, but I'm happy to answer any questions, or Virginia, if you think there needs to be things pointed out that I've left out, by all means.
I think that was pretty thorough, to be honest. the condensed quick version, but yeah. A lot of the work that we do is, I always say, behind the scenes, right? Because you don't always know that it's happening, but we have a lot of meetings with a lot of different people, and Ken and Brian are really instrumental in setting up those meetings for us. And those meetings sometimes are very short. Like, you're not talking about a half an hour meeting. Like, most of the time they're 15 minutes or less. I've learned to become a fast talker and get to what I need to get to. I have been told that I'm very spirited by one legislator because I just get very excited and I'm very passionate about this, and I want to make sure that our message is heard. But those meetings, I will be honest, the first one I was very intimidated, but now I realize they're just people like anyone, like the rest of us. And their job is to listen to us as their constituents. So it's not as scary as one might think just to talk about it. And really, we just talk about what we know, which is school counseling, right? So yeah, definitely.
And we'll get into the grassroots lobbying, I think, in a bit, but I can't emphasize enough is how important it is to have a few key legislators to rely on. And the way that you develop those legislators to rely on is that they have constituents in the district that have connected with them on an issue and they become passionate about it. So really, that's the ultimate goal of CISCA and the grassroots effort. It's to maintain and develop key advocates for our industry. Now, I think we've developed a few. I think we have a lot more to go. I think every time there's an election, it's a whole new crop of candidates potentially, and you have a bunch of new people. But I think with the way the pandemic has played out and the attention on schools and the attention on social emotional learning, I do think that presents an opportunity for our members to talk to their legislators about what's going on in the school system.
Absolutely. So why is everyone advocating so important? The reality is, if we're not advocating for our own profession, then nothing is going to change. We are a minority within a school building. So we are often, I like to think of as the forgotten ones, unfortunately, unless we're speaking up and we're vocal and we're letting people know what it is that we do and why it's important. I have found over the years that we've had an increase in the number of people who've been helping to advocate, whether it be with legislators or their local administrators and boards of ed. And I think it's slowly starting to have an impact, but we definitely have to have more than a few voices. And it can't always just be the same voices, right? Certainly there are some legislators that are very used to speaking with me. And that's okay. I'm glad that they remember who I am and they remember what I have to say. But it definitely needs to be, as Brian said, more people kind of getting in the ear of their legislators to say, this is important to me, because if they hear from multiple people, they're more likely to take up the cause and be like, oh, this is important. People think this is important and we need to do something about it. So it's really important that we're making our voices heard, and we're making, it known what we're looking for and why it's so important that we get these things.
Yeah, and Virginia, and I want to build on that point a little bit because I don't think people fully realize when you're in the school system, every part of that school system is lobbying in some capacity the Connecticut state government. So your superintendent, your first of all, your mayor or your first selectman or your town, they're lobbying as part of CCM or COS, which are the municipal and the town. They're always lobbying on education policies. The Superintendents Association is lobbying on superintendents' priorities. The teachers, whether it's AFT or CEA, they have a huge voice. The retired teachers, they lobby to make sure that they get their pensions done. School social workers, they have the Social Worker Association, psychologists, the principals, associate. There's all kinds of associates. The school boards of ed have lobbyists. So if Cisca is not at the table lobbying, and I think I emphasized this right at the beginning with Virginia, everybody else is in your school, and you're going to be the ones left behind and not prioritized because everybody else is looking out for themselves. And that's why it's so important, because when you're in that education hearing, you see the entire school represented in some capacity or the other. And I can't emphasize that enough, because they might want to help you, but if they're hearing from every other part of the school system and not you, well, they're going to forget, because they're human beings that are hearing from 1,000 different people a week. So I just need to emphasize that and how important it is, because everybody else is advocating for themselves in a school setting.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And if you ever have an opportunity to go to a hearing at the state, you will just realize how many issues there are. And those are only a fraction of what you're hearing. So I think when we sit in an education hearing and we're waiting to be heard, the number of bills that we hear, and that's just one education hearing, and they hold several often. So you're thinking about, that's just the education committee, and then there's appropriations and all these other committees, and there are just thousands of bills that come through. And we really need to just, like we always say, it's the loudest person in the room that gets heard. and sometimes that's true. So in this case, we have to be the most vocal, so that they're hearing what it is that we need. And we're going to talk about how you can do that too. And there are ways to start out small, and then when you feel more comfortable, kind of increasing that. Some of you will feel comfortable right from the beginning because that's just your personality to advocate. I think that's personally why for me it became comfortable very quickly, because that's just my personality. But I think anybody can do this at any level, regardless of how comfortable or not comfortable you are with the process. Again, we feel like there's no greater time than now to advocate for more school counselors in all of our schools with better ratios. I have said it many times, but I feel like there are a lot of people that use SEL as a buzzword, which is irritating to me. But regardless of whether they're using it as a buzzword or they truly and honestly believe in it, the reality is that with COVID, SEL has kind of pushed its way to the forefront. We know that we have kids that are struggling because of all of the changes that have occurred due to COVID. We know we have adults who are struggling in our schools, and connections with students, like parents who are struggling because of everything with COVID. So I feel like this is our perfect opportunity to capitalize on that and say, hey, this is why we need to have more school counselors. One thing that I have noticed in a lot of conversations with different leaders, even educational leaders like superintendents associations, boards of education, etc., is that there often are people who don't understand the scope of SEL, meaning that when they think of and hear SEL, they're thinking of programming and what kind of social emotional skills are we teaching the kids, and what programming can we bring to the classroom that teachers and other staff can implement with students. And that is an important part of the preventative aspect of SEL. However, there's also the other side of SEL supports, and that's where we come in as school counselors, social workers, and school psychologists, where we are supporting the students who may need more than what can be offered in the classroom. And they need to come see us and work with us. And I do feel like in a lot of my conversations, that piece not always overlooked, but it's kind of like, oh yeah, yeah, and we need that. But really, both pieces are incredibly important to the entire picture, and that's what we need to help our legislators to see, that yes, the programming like Second Step and other, social emotional programs are important to our classrooms and our buildings, but the reality is that not all the needs will be met through that for kids, and they need to be able to have those social emotional supports throughout their school day. And that's where we come in. And the reality is we have incredibly high caseloads in some schools. We have schools without any school counselor at all, particularly at the elementary level. And so we need to make sure that every student has access to a school counselor and explaining to them really what that looks like. So there are lots of different ways that you can advocate. And one of the easiest and simplest ways is to send an email to your legislators. And Brian has provided us with, and we can make sure too, especially after the election, that that is updated, but that, we usually put that on our Cisco website, but how you can find out who your legislators are if you don't know, because you have, just like in the federal government, you have your state senators, and then you have your state representatives. So for example, my state senator is Kathy Austin, and my state representative is Tim Ackert. So I was able to figure out who those people are so that I can contact them and get in touch with them. So once you have that information, if you're comfortable placing a phone call, you can call their offices. You might speak to a legislative aide to start with, but you can express that you'd like to speak to, that legislator and why you're calling. But you can also send an email, which I find people seem to be much more comfortable with when starting out. We're going to talk about what to include when you write a letter or you write an email, or your talking points when you actually have a chance to talk to your legislator, so that you have some guidance if you're feeling like, I don't even know where to start with that. Hopefully by the end of today, you will feel comfortable with knowing what direction to move in. But that's how I've always started, is with an email. Sometimes you'll get a canned email back and you'll be able to tell that it's a canned email. And sometimes you'll get a genuine, they put thought into it to write you back email. And they may actually say, if you're requesting a meeting, like let's set up a meeting, I would assume now everything is obviously going to be via Zoom or Google Meet or something to that effect. But I think that can certainly still, happen and occur.
Yeah, I would also look out for one of the first things that I just sent a link in the chat where you can find your legislators, but I would follow them on social media too. They post when they're doing town forums that are local, and if they're hearing counselor questions come up at those town forums, then that's great. So I would follow them, make sure to follow the ways, whether it's on Facebook or Twitter. Those are the most common ways that they're getting their message out, but they also have campaign websites, and they have obviously their General Assembly emails. But really the easiest way is sending them an email, and then if they don't respond, following up with a phone call.
Also, at some point, hopefully when we get back to normal, probably not this year, but a lot of your legislators hold town hall meetings or will set up appointments with you. Jennifer Parsick and I share the same representatives, so we have gone together to town hall meetings. And I will be honest, it probably depends on where you live in the state. We live on the eastern side of the state, so it's pretty less populated and pretty rural. But Tim Ackert held it at the library in Columbia, and so we went and we met with him. We were like 2 of 4 people that showed up. So we really had, and he was very kind, and we were very patient, and he listened to the other 2 gentlemen first and what their concerns were. And then he said, well, these lovely ladies have been waiting, and I see they have information for me to talk to me, so I'm going to turn my attention to them. And he really listened, and he really gave us a good 15, 20 minutes to talk to him. And we provided him with some materials that we had through CSCA. on what we were looking for. And he actually ended up putting forth legislation that year because that was a long session and he was able to put forth legislation. So it definitely had an impact. And it really wasn't that bad. And it was nice that we did it together. So if you can find someone that, you know, shares a legislator with you to have these meetings, sometimes they meet at like Dunkin' Donuts or, you know, other places. You know, it might be a good opportunity to have a personal meeting and have your voice heard.
Let me just add, I expect, first of all, now that they're in campaign mode, they're likely doing functions online now.
Yeah.
So it's possible in the next 2 weeks. But after the election, I suspect the recently elected people will hold either like Zoom meetings or some other forums. And so I would be on the lookout for that, because they'll be asking their constituents, okay, what issues do you want me to bring up in the next session? And that's when, if we have school counselors in, say, just 20 districts going to 20 different legislators, that's potentially a pool of 20 legislators that are going to draft a bill for us.
Yeah, definitely. And the other way to advocate is by testifying. And once we have a school counseling bill out there and it's put into the public hearing, you can testify in a bill, and you can do that a couple ways. Generally, we will send out an email. I will be very honest. We don't always get a lot of notice of when these hearings are going to happen and our bill is going to be heard. So there is often a quick turnaround, but I always try to provide you with a template to make it a little bit easier. But certainly if you just feel comfortable typing up your own thing, that's fine too. And you can submit written testimony. And I'm not sure how it will look this year, but we also have the opportunity to usually testify in person in some capacity. So we're always looking for a few people that can do that too. So if you feel comfortable speaking, you know, in front of the education committee, please let me know. You'd still submit your written testimony, but then you would also, we would try to get you in to be able to speak on behalf of our bill in person, which can have a really great impact. Last year,
go ahead.
Last year we had a record number of people actually do written testimony for our bill, which was awesome. And it made me feel really good because, again, the more people they hear from, even if they skim your testimony and they don't read it word for word, like the sheer impact of like, wow, we have this many school counselors write testimony on this bill. It must really be important to school counselors.
Yeah, they've already done a number of kind of virtual hearings before the special session. So next year might actually be easier for some school counselors to get on one of these hearings when you're in either you're at school or you're home and you're in between classes. So I will keep Cisca posted on how that's going to work, but I suspect a virtual hearing process that might actually be to our favor in terms of getting more grassroots support.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so letter writing 101. We're talking about contacting people and getting in touch with them, and you're like, I don't know what to put in my email. So I kind of put several parts here together for you, and I'll talk a little bit about them. You feel free to screenshot this. This is being recorded and will be put into our Cisca YouTube channel sometime after this. Michelle takes care of that. I don't know how that works, but so if you need to go back to the recording, you can. And I'm also going to include this on our website. Since I do the Cisco website, I'm going to make sure this is also included my PowerPoint on the Cisco website so you can reference back to it if you need to. So first of all, you want to introduce yourself. You know, who are you? What school do you work in? What town do you live in? How long have you been a counselor, etc. So they get an idea who they're talking to. It is perfectly fine for you to reach out if you have different legislators in the town that you work versus where you live. So for example, I live in Columbia and right now I work in Lebanon. So there are, Kathy Austin's still my state senator, but the representative is different. So I could also reach out to that representative as a, you know, working professional in Lebanon. So that's why it's important to include all that kind of information as you introduce yourself. The second thing you want to get right to is we call it the ask. What is your ask? What are you looking for them to care about and want to bring up in session? And so for us, and I have another slide too with this specifically on it, but we want to make sure that our students all have access to a school counselor in all of our schools, not just our middle schools and high schools, but even our elementary schools. So we're asking that there are school counselors in all of our schools at every level, elementary through high school, with ratios of no more than 250 to 1. Now, the reason the no more language to me is really important is we have done some preliminary research, particularly in Connecticut. Jennifer Parsick and Peg Donahue, along with some of their colleagues in other states, have been working on ratio research. ASCA has also commissioned other people to do research on this number. And some of the stuff that we're finding is 250 is really not a hard, fast number. You know, some districts less than 250 is actually working really well. You know, we have some schools that have like 100, you know, in the high hundreds to 1, and that's actually working really well for them. You know, demographics play a big role in this as well. So we want to make sure that we're saying the no more than 250 to 1. And the reason for that is we do have some high schools in particular that have lower ratios than 250 to 1. And we don't want to hurt those schools and the schools all of a sudden being like, oh, well, it says 250 to 1, so we're going to, you know, get rid of a counselor because we can afford to do so. And we don't want that to happen. So we really do want to be careful about that language. We don't want to say, you know, ratios of 250 to 1. It really needs to be no more than. So that's your ask. That's what you want. And you want to be very clear and get right to that. Then you want to talk about, and this I feel like is one of the most important pieces, and Brian, feel free to jump in on this, but you need to talk about your experiences as a school counselor. And this should be the easy part for you because you live this every day. So if you are in a school that has great ratios, it's awesome to talk about how that's benefited you as a school counselor and it's benefited your students in particular. You know, what outcomes have you seen as a result of having appropriate and reasonable ratios in your district? If you're from a district where you don't have good ratios and it has been particularly problematic, talking about what those challenges have been for you as a school counselor. Are there duties that are preventing you from doing your job? What are some of the many tasks that you do all day? Because remember that a couple of things. One, some legislators have zero clue what we do as school counselors. So we need to kind of school them, you know, not in a pages long, because we probably could write pages about all that we do, but not in a pages long way, but in, you know, a succinct way. What are some of the tasks that you are responsible for as a school counselor? Because the other piece is a lot of our legislators had guidance counselors and who are not proactive and were not doing all the social emotional stuff that we're doing now. They were solely really focused on the career piece, and it was more reactive and less preventative. And so we want to get that image out of their mind and get them to truly understand what it is that a school counselor does so that they understand why it's so important that we're in schools. Because what we have found is a lot of legislators that had the G word had bad experiences. So we kind of want to wipe that away, and we want to focus on the positive of what it is that we do and how we impact students. So that part 3, is really about you and your experiences. And I feel like that's where it should be easiest, because just speak from your heart about what it is that you do. Brian, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, just to, I guess, build on that a little bit, but mostly reiterate what you're saying. Make it personal. You got to tell them that you're in their district or your school is in their district. So that right up front needs to be one of the first things you say. I'm a constituent of yours. I work at X school in your district, whatever it is. Keep it simple. Don't try to, you know, it shouldn't be more than a page, for instance, in a Word document if you're giving them a document, but also in terms of an email, not more than a couple of short, you know, paragraphs, a few sentences with the key issues and what your ask is. You know, really in your initial outreach, you should be looking to have a discussion with them at a future time or try to set something up, because you want this to be a continued conversation. So my last tip: personal, simple, and be persistent. They're legislators. They hear from a lot of people. You're not bothering them. They are supposed to be hear from their constituents. You are supposed to follow up with them. So never, I mean, you don't want to be emailing them every day or even weekly. I get it. But if you're emailing them 1 week and the next week you follow up with a call and then 2 weeks later you email them again, I don't care. You know, I email them all the time. Other people email them all the time. That is what their job is. So never be concerned for being persistent. Make it personal, keep it simple, and be persistent in your outreach.
Yeah, it's almost like you want to give them a little bit of a teaser. And then in that part 4, the last part is just wrap it up by restating what your ask is and offer to discuss this further with them, that you would love to meet with them, virtually or whatever, to have a greater conversation about this important need. And then hopefully that will spur, like Brian said, a meeting where you can talk about this even more in depth. That
Yeah,
part 3.
ultimately, and this is not always the case, and it can be just some legislators are like this, but ultimately, you want to be one of the go-to people that your legislator goes to when it relates to any school education policy issues. You want to be one of their contacts locally. Now, that doesn't happen overnight. It sometimes takes years, and even then, sometimes these legislators are not helpful, but if you can make that connection, it really does change the dynamic of having champions for CISCA. And that's really what it's all about, trying to create as many champions as possible.
So this is Cisca's ask that we have been working on for several years, and I'm certain it will be one of our #1 policy priorities. We are meeting, I have to send the meeting out, but we're going to be meeting next week with our GRAC committee and Brian to talk about our policy priorities for the year. But this is always our #1. Connecticut needs school counselors in all of our schools from elementary school to high school with appropriate and reasonable student to counselor ratios of no more than 250 to 1. So where are we now? We passed 2 significant bills, but we haven't reached our ultimate goal. And our ultimate goal of where we want to be is making sure that all of our students in Connecticut have access to a school counselor. This means elementary, middle, and high school counselors in every district with appropriate ratios of no more than 250 to 1. So another piece of things, that's the legislative piece. And I want to spend a little bit of time. I don't want to spend a ton of time on this because I want to be able to answer your questions too. But the other piece that I think is really important, and it's always important, but I think it's even more important this year with COVID, because I think a lot of us are even busier than we normally are with student issues, is talking about how we can advocate with our administration and our boards of education. So obviously we hear it all the time, and we also often reply with, I don't have time for that. But it really is important that we're making the time to collect data so that we can share that data out. How many students do you see? How many groups do you run? How many classroom lessons are you giving? Any pre and post data that you're collecting on groups that you are doing with students or on the classroom lessons that you're giving, and how that's impacting students. And then taking that data and being able to put it into graphs and or reports, and then putting it into a PowerPoint presentation that you can give to your administrative team and say, this is how our school counseling department, even if you're a department of 1 like myself, this is how our school counseling department is having an impact on student success in our building. Because they're less likely to get rid of you if you're able to show the impact that you're having on students. And I think that, a lot of times it's basically how we're asking teachers to do this through testing, whether we agree with that or not. This is how we're showing that we're having an impact on our students and their success. My intern, I have an intern this year, and I was trying to find an easier way to collect data, and she put together this really easy to use Excel sheet where I can literally, I have to type some stuff in, but I can drop down menus and choose things. So I can keep track of what I'm doing all day in a few minutes by inputting who I've met with and, what kind of tasks I've been completing. And then she was able to take that data, and it does a running graph for me on some of these things. So I have to have her show me how she did all of that, because she just did it for me, so that perhaps I could do another workshop to help school counselors on doing that, or perhaps she can make a template for me for people to use if you want to, if that collecting data piece is, one of the pieces that's difficult for you to do. And then you want to present the information to your administration, and if you're able to get to a Board of Ed meeting, to present the impact that school counselors are having, so that hopefully in your district, you know, the school counselors are not the first ones on the chopping block come budget season, which unfortunately is often the case in many of our districts. So how can CSCA help you? One of the ways that we can help is by reviewing letters and materials. So when you're getting ready to write those emails or letters, or maybe even testimony, and you're like, oh, I'm not sure if I'm on the right track, if this looks good, feel free to email it to me at ciscaadvocacy at gmail.com, and I'd be happy to look at it and provide you with feedback if you're really nervous about it. And Brian's always willing to look at our stuff too. So, you know, just don't be afraid to send it our way, and then we'll take a look at it and let you know what we think. We can also attend meetings with you and legislators. We do our best to provide you with somebody who is comfortable from our GRAT committee. And it might even be easier with all this, like Brian said, online Zoom meetings that legislators are probably going to be doing, particularly after the elections. But if you want somebody to kind of be there with you to make you feel more comfortable, you know, we can try to provide that for you if you reach out to us. The other thing that I often try to do is to provide templates and materials, especially when it comes to writing testimony. When I ask for a call for testimony, usually I will attach a template, you know, and I'll put like, make sure to include this in this section, talk about your own experiences. So you're very clear on where you want to add your own stuff and what stuff you can just kind of cut and paste from our template. We also have a bunch of resources on our advocacy page, including a PowerPoint that you could use and change for yourself if you were presenting to your Board of Education or your administrators. So there's lots of different materials on there. I am going to include how Connecticut bill becomes a law on there, so you have that. And I will also make sure that the outline of writing a letter is on there as well. So there's lots of ways that we can help you to do this, but we're happy to help if you're willing to help us to advocate for school counselors. So my email is ciscaadvocacy@gmail.com. You can feel free to email me anytime. I do my best to get back to you in a timely manner. I do try to check the email every single day, but sometimes it gets crazy and there might be a day I don't. But please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to help you with anything that I can help you with. Brian, is there anything you want to add before we open it up to questions?
No, I'll just say that if you have a question for Virginia, just ask her. She'll know the answer.
I try. I've gotten better over the last 4 years. All right. Any questions from our participants today?
I looked at the Find Your Legislator, and there are, so I looked at my town I live in, not the town I teach in. So there are 5 people listed.
Yep.
Do I write to all 5 people?
No, so it's just the state senator and the state legislator. So it will have like Blumenthal, Murphy, and then your congressional person. So your 2 senators.
On there.
Yep, Blumenthal and
I
Murphy.
see Murphy, but
Yep.
then I see a state rep and a state senator.
It's the state, yeah, it's the state rep and the state senator. So disregard Blumenthal and Murphy, and then in terms of the congressional districts, you know, I'm not against, if you want to reach out to them, they do have their own federal agenda, and that's a whole nother conversation that we can get into. But keeping it to the state level, it's really your state rep, who is the best person to reach out to, and your state senator, who's a little less, you know, helpful sometimes because they have a bigger district.
Thank you.
Anybody else? You can also type in the chat if you don't want to speak out loud.
So when you say write a letter, because this is the part that causes anxiety and stress, you said you're going to provide, like just the reach out, you're going to provide the outline to do that. But right now, writing a letter, there's no, we use the ask that you mentioned.
Yeah, I would use that ask for now. like I said, we're going to meet next week to discuss the policy priorities, and then we usually put out a document with those policy priorities. But I think you could reach out today with just that ask, and explaining to them how important it is that we have more school counselors in our schools, because that's never going to be irrelevant. So I think that that's a great way to start, is using that ask and reaching out to your legislators. And like I said, we will provide you, once we finalize our policy priorities, what those are. But then, you know, after the election, we want to focus again on reaching out to our newly elected officials, which could be different than who you're reaching out to now, depending on how the elections go. You know, or if you know somebody who's running. So for example, one of my social studies teachers, my 7th grade social studies teacher this year, is running against Kathleen McCarty in Waterford. And so him and I have had some great conversations about school counselors, because
oh, be careful. Be careful.
yeah, just to, you know, let him know what CSCA is looking for in terms of adding school counselors to schools, and, you know, what support we would be looking for as school counselors. But
it's okay to reach out to your legislator generally too. I mean, if you're reaching out to their CGA email, it's a little different. That's their official capacity. I mean, if you really want to go the extra mile, you could figure out their campaign emails and find their campaign websites or their social media on Facebook or post it. But it's really to begin a conversation and just tell them what is going on, what challenges you're having in their district, in their school. And then after the election is really the opportunity to follow up and say, hey, you know, I reached out before the election, didn't hear anything back, but now, you know, congratulations on the election. I'd love to sit down and talk further about these issues. And it's okay if they don't email you back. It happens. To me, it happens to everybody. So they don't all respond right away. And that's why I say persistence is one of the key things that you need.
And sometimes you get the canned email back. I've gotten that from Kathy Austin before.
Yep.
You know, thank you for your email. Your issue is important to me, blah, blah, blah. But you just, you know, because they usually don't reference what you actually talked about at all. So you're like, oh, okay. But I think it was Tim Acker, actually, when I had emailed him, I actually got an email back, and I felt like it was, even if it came from his aide and not him, but it was more like they referenced the stuff within, you know, the email. But I will tell you, I like to talk about my own experience, because so Jennifer, who's on this call, and I had gone to that town hall at the library with him a few years ago, and he was great. And I mean, I'll speak for myself, but I felt like he really listened to us and he was interested in what we had to talk about. And then we went to do the Day on the Hill that same year, and we were dropping off more information for him, and he happened to come out, and I said, I don't know. He's like, oh, I remember you. Like, he legitimately remembered who I was. And he's like, you're the school counselor. Like, so it does have an impact to actually talk to them and meet with them. And like I said, I mean, not all legislators are created equal, for sure, but he's a pretty nice guy. And I don't feel like you know, I feel like he really cares and he really wants to hear and he wants to listen. And so I think having those contacts is really important. And same thing with Jeff Curry. We've met with Jeff Curry a few times. And he remembered us when we came back to meet with him during the Day on the Hill. We had a meeting with him a couple times prior. And again, he remembered. He's like, oh, yes, the school counselors. And oh, yes, all that, you know, like he remembered the stuff we had talked about. So I think
and I want to use that as an example of why it's beneficial. The more you keep having a point of contact with somebody. So Jeff Curry is now really close friends with the incoming Speaker of the House and has worked very closely with him and has more access. So we've developed somebody, he's not going to carry the day for us, but he's a key person that will help. So it's really just about making more allies, and we're school counselors. So that's like, you know, your natural instinct is probably like to bring people together in the school. It's kind of the same thing when it comes to legislators and bring them to our table. I think we have a winning argument and people want to embrace what we're saying. Oftentimes it's a fiscal question, but if you can get them around to the first part first and acknowledging the problems and the challenges, then maybe we can get to the fiscal stuff, which is obviously the heavier lift that we're paid the big bucks for.
Any other questions? Great questions so far. Or anyone wants to add about their own personal experiences that they've had. Curtis, I know you've met with some legislators before. I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but I know.
I'm gonna tell Curtis who he needs to reach out to in the Danbury area soon.
Oh, they know me.
Yeah.
David Arconti knows.
David, well, Kushner, you got Kushner too. Yeah.
Oh yeah, Julie's sweet too.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I also have talked with Johanna. I mean, I like waved and like we.
Johanna, yeah.
We made eye contact. And the Board of Ed at Danbury knows me very well.
So it's not just Virginia. I mean, there's other people that have been successful in making those connections. It is very possible, no matter what district you're in, if you're persistent, if you're personal, and you keep the message somewhat simple, and you just keep doing it over and over again, you force them to take notice.
Is it suggested to write to both? Like I mentioned that I looked up where I live. I didn't look up the town I work in, but is it recommended to do it in the town you work in also?
I have no issue with it, but I know some counselors feel different ways about it. I definitely.
I'm the only counselor, so that's it. There's only
I'm not firing you anymore.
Oh, I did it in both, Pat, because, working in New Haven and living in a rural part, eastern part of the state, and Coventry, two different areas. So to me, it was important to also have that voice in New Haven as well, and reach out to the legislators there.
Kind of that same idea, because I live in a town, I live in Naugatuck, larger community, but I work in Easton, a very small, affluent community where I am the only counselor in the school. Like Virginia, there's only 2 schools. There's no counselor on the elementary school level, and I have a caseload of 325 kids. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can reach out to obviously where you work, and you can say, I work at this school, and you don't even have to mention that you're constituent. And I think with your actual reps, you can reach out and say, I'm a constituent, I work as a school counselor, and these are the challenges I'm seeing. So I think you just present it slightly differently.
Thank you.
Virginia, I just wanted to thank you for hosting this, for having the meeting today. And it's wonderful to see people joining in on this, because as you and Brian said, it's important that we have increasingly more people that are on that are speaking, that are shouting from the rooftops as well, because that's when the voices will be heard.
Yeah.
And they're heard when it's from multiple parts of the state, multiple
Right.
different types of districts. If we're having the same problems in rural schools that we're having in urban schools, and that they're not having access to counseling, then maybe that's a better coalition to bring together. So there is power in numbers, and just power in diversity of opinions. And on this topic, I don't think partisan.
Yeah. Thanks, Jen. Well, thank you everybody for joining today. I know it's after a school day, it's really exhausting to do one more thing. So I appreciate everyone's time in hopping on today. Again, this is has been recorded and will be eventually, it probably might take a day or two. Michelle will put it up on the CSCA YouTube channel. So I've never been on it, so I assume you just search CSCA on YouTube and it should come up. And we put all our recorded webinars and stuff on there. And I will be adding some of those things to the CSCA website tonight when I get home. So there'll be even more resources available to you. And if you have any questions, again, please feel free to reach out to me at CSCAadvocacy@gmail.com.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks. Have a great night, everyone.